Hi, I'm Dave Travis, the CEO of Leadership Network. I'm pleased today to introduce you to Chuck Fromm. Many of you know Chuck from Worship Leader Magazine. But he and I had a good conversation the other day, and I just wanted to share some of it with you today because I think you'll find it enlightening and interesting. So, Chuck, first, tell folks who you are.
Well, I'm still trying to discover that, Dave. At 63, with four young adults and a 16-year-old. My wife and I just celebrated our 30th anniversary. I actually started out of college where I had a music minor to be a city manager. And so my career started in community development, actually was as a city manager, an assistant to a city manager of a small city in Northern California, actually where Charlie Peacock lived as well. He was at that high school. And my roommate and I started promoting conferences, or not conferences, but concerts and events all week long, all up and down the Northern California coast. And every place that we started these events, churches started. We didn't realize we were in the church planting enterprise. We just knew that people wanted to learn about Jesus. It was at the height of the Jesus revival, the Jesus movement revival, 1970 to 1974. And so I got drafted into music. Pastor Chuck Smith asked me to come down and run Maranatha Music. And so I started that process. That was like 25 years of my life. But music takes you a lot of places. It takes you across boundaries. A good song will sing in any denomination, and it brings the past into the present. It could be a song that was written 500 years ago, at least the lyrics. So that my whole life has been formed around music, or you should say the promotion of it. You know, I tell people I'm a promoter with a PhD, and that's I don't know why a promoter needs that. That's another part of my life is the academic world.
Yeah, well, great.
Is that enough or too much? Or
no, that's just fine. We had a conversation the other day about hymns, songs, and spiritual songs.
Yeah.
Why is that concept important?
Well, first of all, it's very biblical. In Ephesians 3, Colossians 4. That's the menu that Paul lays out for congregational song. That we're to speak to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And that's a triad. It's like a genre, if you will. And I'm always interested in triads. And so it lays out a real defining boundary lines in terms of the different kinds of songs and the variety of song. I mean, nothing is necessarily fully a psalm because even though the lyrics may be ancient, the music is going to be something that we know how to sing. We don't know how to chant. We don't know actually how these were performed. What we're talking about is the content and the function. You know, singing the Psalms takes us back to celebrating the spiritual life of the Israelites. I mean, the Psalms were 5 books written over a 1,000-year period. It's sort of the best of the best, and written in Canaanite style, the poetic style of the time. So Psalms like anchor us historically, and they're all about looking forward to the Messiah. Of course, Christian psalms or hymns, we tend to call those, we're looking back and forward. We're looking back to, yes, the Messiah did come, and he's coming again. So they have that kind of orientation. And spiritual song, the third part of the triad, tends to be more like what we found in the Jesus movement. It's the praise song, what became labeled and mediated as contemporary Christian music. Was really spiritual song, or heart song, or folk song would be another way to say it. I hear ducks quacking. Is that at your place or mine?
It must be in yours.
It's in my head.
That may be so. Well, are you saying that it's important for congregations to emphasize all three types?
Well,
Or go ahead.
yes, yeah, because as I told you, we get focused on a particular style. Let me give you another triad. This is a classic rhetorical triad. Form, function, form, content, and function. All right. So music has a form, a particular style. I mean, the cultural wars in the 80s and 90s, and even somewhere to the present day. I mean, when I started at Maranatha Music, I got really tough letters from famous radio evangelists about having drums and guitars on records and how we were doing the devil's work. Just with that. But that's been the history of new instruments in worship. The same thing happened when the piano was introduced in the late 19th century, or the first pipe organ that was brought to America sat in a Boston harbor in the late 1600s because it was for 6 months, because it was so controversial they didn't want to bring it ashore. So instrumentation, changes of instrumentation or form have always been controversial. But then you have content. Okay, what is actually being said in terms of the lyrics? Is this really a song to or about God? And then function is usually the question that's not even asked today. Like, it's just assumed that if it's good music, it will attract, and we want attraction in music so that we have more people to preach to. So the function of music is rather truncated in terms of understanding. What people get focused on is the style or the form. Now, did I answer your question, or did I throw?
I think so. We talked about how hymns, songs, and spiritual songs, that a church needs all three.
Just saying that is important.
Yep.
Just saying that. Say, hey, you know what? The Bible has something to say about the menu. I don't care what kind of church plant you're going to call it. It has something to say about the kinds of music, and they're very different kinds. They may flow together in some way. Hang on just a second. I got to shut this door.
Okay. By the way, Chuck lives in San Juan Capistrano, and we're looking out the window there of his office there.
Yeah. There's rattlesnakes on that hill, buddy.
Yeah.
And hawks.
Well,
nature has its play out there.
There you go. Well, so describe just quickly the differences between, as you see it, the Psalms, songs, and spiritual songs.
Okay, well,
that's what we need to know.
Yeah. First of all, that in and of itself has been controversial or misunderstood. Let me tell you how. When we think of a hymn in the 21st century, we actually have in our mind, when we think of a Christian hymn, we think of the 17th and 18th century, Elizabethan period of English. Very Western and so we think of hymns as Elizabethan sounding, where we selected maybe 4 or 5 verses, and it's iambic pentameter poetry. So we got a real stylized understanding of a hymn. About 3 years ago, when I was doing my dissertation work, actually 10 years ago on that, but about 4 years ago, I had discovered through my studies that the first Christian hymn book was a book called the Odes of Solomon, and written between 80 to 120 AD. And we hired a producer, musician, John Schreiner, to arrange these, and we did the Odes of Solomon project. Because these were hymns that went back to the 2nd century, which, by the way, I think a lot more needs to be done on that work, because it's the folk roots of our Christian community. And what I believe is that we need to define a hymn not just from a stylistic perspective, but we need to define a hymn from a functional perspective. And for a function, what a hymn does is it's a song that you and I and the whole church world can sing. It's cross-cultural, it's cross-generational, and we need to come back to functional definitions of all three of these types, and the hymn is one again. They're like, Lord, I lift your name on high. Would categorize I would categorize it as a contemporary hymn. Now
Okay.
that would, I think the Hymn Society would too, because see, they haven't really been able to lock onto what that is because we're so stuck in this stylistic frame of mind of the way that a hymn should sound. It should sound like King James English.
Got it. Well, you said to me that all worship teams are beginning to look the same. What do you mean by that? And what's the problem with that?
Unfortunately, look, that's probably a bit of an overstatement on my part.
Well, of course, but that's
in commerce, in retail, in the music biz, for example, there's a phenomena that occurs, and it's a big word. It's got 3 syllables. Okay, so I'll try it on you, but no, it's got 4. Isomorphism. Everything becomes like everything else. And I'll never forget a time when Peter Drucker, I was talking with him, to drop a name. I also talk to God and try to listen, but anyway, Drucker said, Chuck, he said, there's not one right way to manage. God made 30,000 species of flies, and then he got on with cockroaches. And what happens in the commercial, when things get commercialized, they're mediated, they tend to, people like create to the form of that media. And so then they look at if they're being sold, there's a hierarchy. There's number 1, number 2, number 3. So naturally you go like, okay, what's number 1 and what are they doing? And so songwriters and people will try to emulate that. And all of a sudden, people wake up all of a sudden a couple years later and go, why does everything sound the same? Well, they're looking at the same model, and there's a much greater variety. There's 30,000 species of flies before we get on to cockroaches. And so from a creative point of view, there's a tendency for people to go visit churches or go to this, and they'll see a model and they'll, some kind of success with that, and that becomes the music of that tribe or of that church. I think I said it was like 3 guys and a girl, blonde, making worship, for 20 minutes. And most often when I see that, not always, but most often you got people in comfortable chairs sitting back watching and listening, just waiting for it to get done so that the pastor can preach. And our services of worship and the use of music, actually, I read an article by Edward Foley several years ago, very important article. I'll send it to you if people want it. It's like the 7 functions of music in worship. There's 7. One of them is accompanying the congregation in song. There's 6 other functions that we need to. So in the triad, the rhetorical triad, I say we have to sort of overlay that, see how that fits with, spiritual song. I think spiritual song can be like jazz or rather formless kind of singing, but it's also means folk music, heart music. That's Jimmy up there. We know Jimmy. We know his story. That music makes sense to us because we know the context. I remember several years ago, I was visiting Willow Creek, and at the time I was publishing Maranatha Music, and they're singing a bunch of songs that were blah, 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 blah. Then this one song came up, and the roof went off. Everybody sang it. The title of the song was He is Able, more than able to do. Well, that song was birthed out of a crisis point in the church. Mm-hmm. And that song then was the heart song, I would say, of that community. That's what I'm aiming for. I'm a community folk music guy. Yeah. Because that's the closest to, I think, the purest form of mediation between congregation and and God.
Yeah.
And by the way, I think music is meant to be both vertical and horizontal. We're to speak to God, but the scripture is very clear there. We are to speak to one another. And we need to be conscious of our role in inspiring each other in the music that we sing, not just inspiring the worship team.
Well, that kind of relates to the next thing you said to me was that, all great congregations and all great churches have a sound signature,
right.
Which I guess a part of that is that heart cry that
right.
is that. But also you say it's the first line of theology for any church.
Right.
What music's like. Say more about that.
Well, first of all theology is local. It's not in a seminary. It's worked out through the sermons and the life of a congregation. So writing songs in a community, and I've been involved with Calvary Chapel, several churches that are producers of song. And every movement has a sound, captures the heart song of that movement, the folk song of that movement. As it's mediated later, it might be called hymns. But, if you look at a hymn book, I got one right here, this is the New Baptist hymnal, okay? So, are you Baptist, Dave?
I am.
Okay, so, I wonder how many of these would be hymns for you.
Right.
That's the problem. They were hymns selected out of hundreds of thousands, okay, over the last 2 centuries. And how they got in here, I'm sure there was a political process involved. And then whenever you have a committee, it's political. And this is all done by committee. But these are not the songs necessarily that have lasted and are worthy, other than maybe, probably some Christmas carols in here and a few others, that have come down through the century. But the reality is, no, we need to curate the real hymns of the congregation. That's the worship leader's job.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're trying to create for the worship leader, by the way, is tools to help them be the curator. Because, see, this little book used to be a major financial support for denominations, right? Publishing this thing. But now it's not really affordable for them to do that.
Right.
So it's becoming more and more incumbent. I'm sort of wandering off point, but anyway, my point is that this is part of print culture that's quickly becoming an artifact.
Sure. Well,
what was your question again, Dave? I need to answer those.
You got it. No.
Okay.
One of the things, you lead Worship Leader, which is a magazine. It's got a couple other services, a couple conferences. Tell everybody about Worship Leader and just beyond just the magazine.
Well, okay. So when I got to Maranatha Music in 1975, they had just released the Praise album, first Praise album, sort of the granddaddy. That was like 1974, and it was a collection of the folk song of the movement, the Jesus movement. And all those songs everybody knew. We just put it into a media format that could turn their car into a sanctuary. That's what I like to say, or their home into the sanctuary. They could sing along, and the songs, as they do, a key word in worship is remember, put back together again. Well, when you hear certain music, like worship music, it puts you back into the congregation again. It puts you back into those times. It creates a sacred space wherever you might be. So my bright idea was, well, hey, let's make a series out of it. So we started doing that, and then I got to say, there's a philosophy there too. I feel like part of the problem that we have often with music is one of the most narcissistic industries in our country. It's all, the saying, musicians are trained to show up and show off. And we're interested in music that serves the service of worship. In other words, it's iconographic. It's something that points to the reality. It's not saying, look at me. It's saying, look at God. And that's difficult to do because we're not culturally trained that way, to perform that way, to work for transparency and performance. So that, along with the fact that there was dozens of people starting to produce praise albums and worship albums and so on and so forth. And we were doing other concept records, like we did Psalms Alive and things of this nature, because worship music is really conceptual in my mind. And that, so I, around 1995, actually 92, was I thought, we need to really, I'm an educator, we need to train people in worship and leadership. So we put those two words together, and voila, we had worship leader. And that was before there was an office or a role or a job called worship leader. The job description was music minister, which in some ways may even be superior. But worship leader is what stuck for us. And that was 1992, January. We put out our first issue. And by the grace of God, for the last 20 plus years, we've been producing worship leader. Before that, I did a thing called Worship Journal, which I want to start up again. Because now, Dave, there's at least 200 universities and colleges teaching worship leadership.
Right.
Like maybe 5, 10 years ago, there might have been one or two. There's, hundreds of books that come out now every year on worship. 15, 20 years ago, all you had was like Bob Weber, Worship Old and New, and something by Tozer, Recovering the Missing Jewel, and maybe a couple others. So there's a lot of training talk going on. So we formed Worship Leader Magazine. We started doing the conferences 6 years ago. Next year we'll do 4. We have one actually coming to Dallas. We started in Austin. So we'll be in Dallas in late February at Bit3, doing a National Worship Leader Conference, we call it.
And you
That's
also
a little plug.
Yeah, you got the Song Discovery service. You also have a couple other pieces, the Songwriters Workshop. Tell us a little about those.
Well, Song Discovery, when there's a overabundance of, let's say, spiritual song, and you want to know, you're diving into this lake, which has become an ocean, you go like, I need some help in finding something that may be adaptable, because you can adapt spiritual song from all over. I just argue you also need a songwriter. Release the poets. If you want revival in your community, release the poets. I look at these church growth planning conferences, and they say nothing about that or how to do it. But if it wasn't for the spiritual song being put out in the Everlasting Living Jesus Music Concert Record and Love Song and these things, there wouldn't have been a Calvary Chapel. And now there's 1,500 of them.
Yeah.
No, music is a critical ingredient. Now I got on my soapbox. What do you want to know?
You've got the Songwriters Workshop.
Songwriter is, and every church needs at least one songwriter. Some traditions were that way. The Moravians, especially, the pastor was a hymn writer. He would not only preach a sermon, but he'd write a song that went with the theme of the. I got to tell you this. Several years ago, a large Presbyterian, well-known pastor I was having dinner with him, and he was telling me how he just got like $300,000 grant to take some Isaac Watts songs and arrange them, especially for the orchestra. And he asked me what I thought about that. I said, well, you know what? For $300,000, I could hire 3 songwriters for probably about 4 years, and they could every week create a new song for you. And one of those, or 2 of those, or 3 of those, or maybe a dozen of them will stick and become the heartbeat of your congregation. I mean, I think churches could be that unique. It's like, okay, you join us. Going back to one of the first questions you asked was, about every movement has its folk song, its sound. With Promise Keepers, I was running Maranatha Music when we were doing that, all the music for Promise Keepers in the 90s. And what we would do is create a praise band. We called it record. We called it actually a Promise Keeper band. And we would take like 12 songs and send those songs out to every registrant. So when the guys would come to the stadiums, they knew the song. If you're going to be part of the movement, you need to know the songs of the movement. I mean, the first Wesley hymnal printed some 1880, something like that, it would have been 1780s, 1880. They were long in heaven. But the first psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs hymn book that they produced was titled "For the Songs for the People Who Call Themselves the Methodists."
Yeah.
Okay? People call themselves contemporary because they sing contemporary songs, whatever that is.
Right.
By contemporary is usually falsely defined. As you say, well, what does contemporary mean? You say, well, it's not traditional. And you say, okay, well, what is traditional? Well, it's not contemporary. Well, that's definition by non-definition, which is no definition. You know, so the reality is that contemporary, the closest we get to that is like the heart song, and that heart song can mature over time if it sticks to being a hymn. And I was at our Worship Conference in Kansas recently, and there's Lamentations 3 had become real close to me. It was a song that we recorded in 1980 on Praise 5, and it's the title of it goes, "The Steadfast Love." It was, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases." Sorry about my voice. I don't record, I produce.
Yeah.
His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Well, here's the thing that got me. There's 2,000 people there. I just started singing that because it had become a prayer. His mercies are new every morning. We looked for, you know what? It lit up like a match. Everybody knew that song.
Yeah.
You know, that could be a good candidate for a hymn.
Yeah, sure.
That's what ought to go in the book or whatever replaces this.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, you talked about to me, the last thing I want to ask about is something you're developing called the Worship Tablet.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, actually, and that I had something to show you here. I showed you the Baptist hymnal. Oh, by the way, here's my wife and I. That's the picture that was in the paper when we got busted for our Bible study. Oh, here's something I don't think you've seen. Check out that leisure clothing.
Back it up a little bit there. Oh, there you go.
See, that's John Wimber and Gerald McCracken, who founded Word, and Wimber and the Vineyard.
Yep.
And little old me at 28.
Yep.
That was our Maranatha music deal.
There you go.
This is the inspiration for the worship tablet, Moses.
Okay.
Can you see that? And the
back it up just a little bit there, Chuck. Yep, there you go. So you've got
he's not bringing down stones; he's bringing down iPads.
Right.
You know, the Word of God was first printed on stone. Now it's silicon. But the idea of that is to use the two print artifacts. You know, this the hymn book, and this, you know, the Bible.
Right.
I mean, these are two books you find in every pew in churches that usually aren't pulled out because people are looking at their iPads or their iPhones or what have you for their scripture, and they're looking at the overheads for lyrics. You know, so what I'm saying is these things need to do this, boom, converge into one app that you can, as you're reading your electronic Bible, you can touch the key where it's indicated, and you'll find a song that's been curated to that verse.
Got it.
That does two things. It really helps people understand the content. You know, one of the three parts of the triad. Not just focus on form, but what is the content of this, and how can it function for devotion? So we're working on that with ebible.com. I'm sure there'll be many, you know, that will come out, but it needs to be done. And what I want is a tool for a worship leader to basically create their own hymnal. All right, as songs come along and they adapt them or they get rid of them, and they could put it into their worship tablet, and then people can learn them. You know, they can, in fact, they could find out what's going to be sung before they come to worship. There's all kinds of things that we can do now digitally that hopefully will start to mature here in the next year or two. I was
Great.
talking to a Korean group just yesterday about this. They already have some really advanced apps down there for their community.
Cool.
So,
Okay. Well, Chuck, tell folks how they can find Worship Leader, find you. You mentioned a paper you'd like to send them. Tell them how they can get a hold of you.
okay, just email me.
Yes.
That'd be the best.
And give them.
Email Chuck at WLMag.com. WLMagazine.com. Yeah. Email me. I'll send you. We're online, of course, we have a worshipleader.com website. But to get to me personally, I'd love to talk to you, follow through on any of this stuff I've thrown out at you. Oh, by the way, look what I found. Remember these, Dave? You remember them.
Is that a 8-track?
That's an 8-track.
There you go. Well, yeah.
This used to be contemporary.
Absolutely. I had one of those in my first car.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I want to thank Chuck Fromm for being with us today. Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you, Dave.
Praise God for all that you're doing through Worship Leader and helping worship leaders and lifting up their arms around the world. So thanks very much, Chuck.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. It's a pleasure.